Hi, welcome to our next episode of An Arab and a Jew. And this time we're going to talk about a question that has come up recently, especially with the wave of violence in Israel. Israelis tend to be very concerned about security, also security for the Jewish people. And today we're going to delve into what does this mean? What is Jewish security? And what does it take not only to achieve Jewish security, but to make the Jewish people and Israelis feel secure? So Lee, I guess you can begin with I grew up inside Jewish culture. Lee comes from outside the culture. I guess we can start with the outside perspective. What do you make of it as an outsider?
Hi, Rebecca. Good to be back. One of the things from the outside that, and I don't necessarily believe that I represent 100% of views, but as an individual looking in, it seems to me that Jewish people are overly paranoid about security to a level that, that seems to border on paranoia. That doesn't seem warranted, given the strength of Israel and the international ethics that exist in the world today.
So Jewish people, there is a context here. If Jews have a long history where repeatedly in our history, the places we've been in have abruptly gone from being very palatable, reasonable, safe places to completely untenable. And a good example, but not unique in our history, was the Holocaust. The Holocaust looms large for us because it was recent and it affected so many of us. And a lot of the things that some of the things that Jews do today, although this is getting less, are a reaction to the Holocaust. I do think we need to put the Holocaust in perspective. The Holocaust was an exceptional situation, and this is something else. People talk about World War II, the Nazis, and one of the reasons that they were such a challenge to deal with is that they took the world by surprise. There are very few groups and people who are like the Nazis. So the world underestimated the threat that they posed until it was quite late.
Yeah, and that's true. That's certainly true. So I'm looking at, say, the African Americans in the US who had a rough time during the Jim Crow era. And do you think that they suffer a similar level of paranoia, or do you think that that it was more atrocious in terms of Jewish suffering, so therefore they're entitled to be more paranoid? Or so what's your perspective? Basically, if you were comparing, say, Black African Americans to Jewish people.
Okay, so I'm actually going to throw in Palestinians as the comparison. I can't really comment on the cultures perfectly, but neither group seems to have experienced in their cultural memory many abrupt persecutions. With African Americans, the trajectory has, post-slavery, pre-slavery, the memory of their culture, unfortunately and sadly, was largely lost. But what African Americans did tend to experience is either that they've been kept down pretty consistently, or a steady improvement in their welfare.
Okay,
What?
So Jewish people have had a dramatic improvement in their welfare given the state of Israel. So in comparison, say the Black African Americans don't have their own state, don't have the ability to self-determine as a racial group, and are part of what was a fairly oppressive society.
Well, African Americans, their self-determination movement that at some level was analogous to Zionism was the movement to create the state of Liberia. Now, the state of Liberia, it was populated by African Americans, and it had struggles between the African Americans and the natives, but the African Americans who went to Liberia were only a tiny minority of all African Americans. The vast majority of the African Americans were not interested in self-determination. What they were interested in was social equality. And so that's another difference.
I get a sense that if the Second World War didn't happen, if the Holocaust didn't happen, that would have been a similar trajectory for Jews.
What would have been a similar trajectory for Jews?
So in the early days of Zionism, I understand there wasn't a lot of take up amongst the Jewish people around the world. And it wasn't until the Holocaust came to light that Zionism became popular amongst Jews. Is that a fair assumption?
I would call Zionists, as the movement was picking up steam, I would call Zionists a significant minority even before World War II. Now, it's possible that Zionists were more inclined to leave countries that were untenable for Jews. So it's possible that the Holocaust disproportionately killed off anti-Zionists and non-Zionists. And so that's another explanation of why Zionism could have increased in its prevalence in the Jewish population, but they were already significant in numbers. They were tapping into other movements.
I don't know where I saw this number, but I believe at the turn of the century, so Zionism, say, began the late 19th century, and by the early 20th century, there was only about 6,000. And I don't know how they got the number or where I saw the number, but I remember reading something that said there was about 6,000 Zionist Jews around the world by, say, 1910.
Zionism as a political movement took time to pick up steam. I would be surprised if there were only 6,000, because Zionist clubs, Zionist organizations, they were part of a lot of Jewish communities. They were part of a lot of Jewish communities. There was, of course, opposition to Zionism because it was a new idea. In the 19th century, political Zionism, Jewish yearning for a state in the land of Israel in Messianic times is not new. Jewish yearning for a state in the land of Israel as a pipe dream is not new. An active political movement to create a modern Republican nation state, that's what's new. That type of nation state is new. And so that kind of a movement, it had to pick up steam. And I don't think it was just the Holocaust. If there had not been a Holocaust, there might have been other types of Zionism that came to the fore. but there would still have been possibly, it's not clear, possibly even more Jews coming to the land of Palestine.
But with the idea, okay, so with the idea that they wanted self-determination in the state of Palestine, and with the international support that they got. So I'm suggesting that the Holocaust amplified that dramatically, both international support for a state, the Jewish need for self-determination, and the fear amongst Jews that if they didn't do this, that they wouldn't be safe.
The Holocaust the Holocaust gave Zionism another argument that was very powerful to a lot of people, both inside and outside the Jewish community. Now, Zionism, there are a lot of types of Zionism, and not all of them are about self-determination. Some are just about making the land of Israel into the Jewish homeland. So Peter,
yeah, I have to admit, more and more as time goes on, I resent the term Zionism because it can mean so many things to so many people. And it can be as simple as self-determination for Jews to recreating the biblical Israel of 2 millennia ago. And you know, it's got so many dimensions and layers. Like, you know, is it exclusive? Can it be at the cost of other people's rights? There's whole sets of art. So the idea of Zionism, the term I don't necessarily agree with. I don't think that it has been properly defined. I know there are people that say it's as simple as self-determination for the Jews in Israel. I don't believe that's the case. What do you call Israel? Does it extend to the West Bank? Does it extend to Gaza? And where in the ranking is self-determination for Jews? Does it sit above or below Palestinian rights? So there's a whole element of there are whole layers that need to be peeled back when you use the term Zionism. So I guess I know a lot of very good Jewish people who are very liberal, who will still regard themselves as Zionists, but what they mean by Zionism is very different to what an extreme religious Jewish Zionist might mean.
Well, that's also what can happen. Like maybe one of the ways to view Zionism is as the equivalent of a political party. If you're talking about something like, Zionism is a little more one issue than a political party, but a political party as well will have its ideology evolve over time, and even the groups that it represents evolve over time. But if you have a political party that's representative of a particular group, then it's almost like how are you going to formulate what the group is? Assume the group is relatively fixed who they are, but how do you formulate what the group is and how they define their government or their cultural identity? So these are the sorts of things that are going to change over time. Zionism as a label, it's kind of like anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is another one that in a lot of cases, it's a cultural marker. It's not exactly a single ideology, and it's got a lot of strains, it's got a lot of threads, and
it's very much like the term, say, Black Lives Matter. And it has a lot of nuances, as a movement, what's it really representing? Of course, Black Lives Matter. Of course, Blacks shouldn't be targeted by policemen or law, but do other lives matter? Of course they do. Is it a term that suggests other lives don't matter, or is it a term that's just trying to highlight that that there is an inordinate amount of Black deaths in custody over and above other deaths?
Yeah. Yes. Well, here's how I see it, though, as applied to IP. Well, I think Black Lives Matter. Well, yes, all lives matter, but Black Lives Matter because we need to give this extra attention because it's an area that we've been failing in. And yes. So the slogan All Lives Matter plays to the weaknesses of the slogan Black Lives Matter, even though Black Lives Matter, if you think about what its intent is, yes, that's a very valid point, that Blacks do have shorter life expectancy than whites in the United States, and all kinds of other things, lower salaries, more intergenerational poverty, a lot of things. And plus,
so go back to this idea of Black Americans and Jews as an analogy. So a lot of Jews, or certainly most of the Jews alive today, would have some connection to survivors of the Holocaust.
I'm not so sure of that. I would say many Ashkenazi Jews alive today would have some connection to survivors of the Holocaust. I do. 2 of my great-grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, and my grandpa fled. But if you have
so go back to the African American. Is there a group of African Americans that or do a similar amount of African Americans or a substantial amount of African Americans have that were slaves?
Yes, I would say the vast majority of African Americans are descendants of slaves.
Okay.
The other thing is, what is an African American? If you were an African immigrant, then to America, then by a number of definitions, you're not an African American. You basically should be born in the United States, I believe. And so this is why Obama is an African American, because he was born in the United States. And well, at least according to this definition. Now, the vast majority of African Americans, just because of the numbers, are descendants of slaves.
Okay, so that would have been a fairly traumatic period for their forefathers.
Yeah.
And many of them would have suffered tremendously as slaves. So why don't they feel the same sense of paranoia that Jewish descendants do, Jewish descendants of the Holocaust do?
I've mentioned this because, okay, first of all, slavery is not as recent. Second of all, because in their historical memory, and we're talking about what period of history is their cultural memory. In their cultural historical memory, the trend for them has been
the improvement.
An improvement.
But I think the same has been true of Jews from the Holocaust to now.
Except Jewish historical memory includes many periods that are before the Holocaust. And so, for example, it includes the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, which is another instance where And
But the same applies for blacks. So at some point, they were kidnapped from Africa on slave ships and treated as chattel and goods and bought into slave auctions in the US. So there's this, and that could have been another 2 or 3 generations back.
And their historical memory of the period of time when they were in Africa has been erased. Essentially, their historical memory begins with slavery, even begins with post-slavery. They've tried to trace their ancestry, and
yes.
They can't usually trace it to particular tribes in Africa.
Yes.
And so their historical memory doesn't tend to be very specific about what happened in Africa. So this is one difference, I would say, with Jews.
But do you think that's enough? Do you think that's enough to create various levels of paranoia? Paranoia is the wrong word. Various levels of a need for security.
I think there are other factors in here too. I think that one of them is, for example, is that Jews tend to belong to the middle and upper classes in a lot of societies. So why would that be? Because it requires a certain stability to have a Jewish life. It requires a certain stability of circumstances to have a Jewish life. And so this means that there's an element of selection in many places for Jews that are above a certain socioeconomic status. Now, people who are in upper socioeconomic strata are going to have stricter standards about their safety and security, depending on the society, than people who are in a lower socioeconomic strata. So, for example, Israeli Jews, it's a very heavily Ashkenazi culture. Ashkenazim have a strong Western influence. They were relatively well-off Westerners. And so that means that they're going to have a stricter sensibility about their safety and security than, say, people who come from a more third world type place. That's another factor. I also do think that there are aspects of Jewish culture that emphasize safety and security more than other cultures do. There's a lot, even in Jewish law, almost all of the things in Jewish law are not applicable to life and death situations. There are only a few situations in Jewish law that are still applicable, even if the person would die doing them. And that's a little different between Judaism and a lot of other religions. But basically, being more safety-minded, whether or not it actually works, is definitely a part of Jewish culture.
Well, from what you're suggesting, one of the elements of why Jewish people are a little more safety conscious than African Americans is the distance between the atrocity, say the Holocaust, and now is much shorter than, say, slavery for African Americans and now. So that time period, that they've had time. So are you suggesting that maybe in another 3 or 4 generations, the Jewish community won't be as safety conscious or paranoid about security as what they are now?
I think that in another 3 or 4 generations, if lifespan increases, African Americans will have stricter standards about safety. Like even in my lifetime, I've noticed a number of things that relate to safety getting stricter. So for example, playground equipment. This is not specifically Jewish, but playgrounds that used to be nothing, used to be this is what we played on, and suddenly people have decided they're not safe. Toys as well. Suddenly people have decided that the toys that I used to play with are not safe, and they changed them in certain ways. In America, one of the things that's happened is that the lifespan of the rich, the lifespan of the well-off has increased. The lifespan of the not so well-off, depending, has probably decreased. But with the lifespan of the well-off increasing, there are a lot of little safety things that suddenly become more relevant. And so I do think that if we can get medical care better, all Americans will have concerns about safety that we don't have now.
Okay, so you think rather than in generations to come, rather than Jewish people becoming less concerned about safety, you think African Americans will become more concerned about safety and reach the level of the Jewish communities?
I would say it depends on what their risks are, but quite likely. Like our concerns about safety in a lot of ways are way more. I remember a time when there were no airbags in cars. Cars are one of the most dangerous things, and people would drive them without airbags. It used to be that seatbelts weren't mandated in cars. There were all kinds of things like that.
But I mean, there's a rational element to those progressions. So for example, when cars were first built, they were built out of steel. And the more sturdy they were, the more they were considered safe. Then it became obvious that in an impact collision, steel is going to project you inside the car in the same direction that the car was heading. So they became more crescendo style alloys that would bend in a collision so that the jolt wouldn't be as impactful, which seemed a little bit counterintuitive. Then they added the seatbelts. Then they added, when technology improved, they added the airbags. Then they've added things like ABS brakes, which is standard now in every vehicle. So as we've progressed with technology and science, we've improved safety. That's not necessarily the case. What we're talking about are more emotive rather than rational.
Although if you actually look at the statistics, Israel's measures have taken down the rate of violence within the country. It used to be that there were random suicide bombings all the time. Now the number of people that in Israel that are killed by attacks is way lower. And
look, it's certainly the job of any government to protect its citizens. But I mean, in reality, let's say that the population of Israel is 10 million, and let's say in any given year, 10 Israelis are killed by suicide attacks. As a percentage of the overall population in terms of real danger posed to individuals, it's minuscule. I mean, it's a horrific act, and it's terrifying, but the chances of a Israeli falling victim in any year to a terrorist attack is 10 in 10 million, which is 0.001%, you know, so you got a better chance of getting killed crossing the road than you do falling victim to a terror, even in the worst years of the Second Intifada.
In fact, Israelis, most of them of that time, knew somebody who had been killed in a suicide bombing. That's one of the reasons that it loomed so large, because it was real to them. It wasn't just something that they heard on the news. It was something that they actually knew about from their own personal experience. And so because of this, they responded. Because of this, they needed a response to it.
No, look, I'm not suggesting that the government shouldn't do something to protect its citizens. I'm suggesting that the reaction was, I mean, look, 9/11, the reaction to 9/11 changed the world. The reality is that Americans, as a result of terrorist attacks, dying is minuscule as well. So maybe the reaction didn't warrant. The action didn't warrant the reaction.
Well, the reaction to 9/11 did not seem to address 9/11. It did seem to have an element of, okay, this is an excuse to go after some Arabs and Middle Easterners, and almost like one is as good as another. There was not a clear connection between bin Laden and Saddam, for example. It was almost like Bush had an axe to grind, maybe from the war Desert Storm fought by his father. And did he think that his father should have finished the job and taken out Saddam? Well, I don't know what we were doing in Iraq. It wasn't clear to me. And Hussein, as awful as he was not clearly connected with bin Laden.
Do you, and I think that was, so I go back to this idea that these are emotive reactions, not necessarily rational reactions. And I remember being in Washington when Saddam was found in a rabbit hole, and there was a news crew on the street trying to garnish opinions from just the general public. And the guy stopped me and said, we're talking to people about what happened. What happened today. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, we caught Saddam in the rabbit hole. What are your thoughts? I said, yeah, that's great that you caught him, but what did you want him for? He said, well, you know, 9/11 and the terrorist bombings. I said, but you've got the wrong man. And his reaction was, but he turned the camera off, or he made the cameraman turn the camera off, which is interesting in itself, because you wonder whether he really knows that his reaction is not rational. But he said, look, I don't know about who committed 9/11, but I worked in a farm, and my father worked from sunrise to sunset. And when somebody comes into my country and blows up one of my buildings, someone's got to pay. And it was that someone's got to, yeah, but you've got the wrong guy. I don't care, someone's got to pay.
Yeah, well, my reaction is Saddam is a war criminal. I do not connect this to 9/11. An analogy perhaps is the Arab Spring. They got rid of Mubarak, they got rid of Gaddafi, they got rid of a number of other leaders in the region. These are war criminals and justice was served, and the same happened to Saddam. But this is not connected to 9/11.
And yeah, no, it's not. But in the minds of a lot of people, it is. And it's almost like they're Arabs. And I think when I'm talking to people about the Israel-Palestine conflict, it's the thing that's the most prominent that really grates on me is Palestinians are Arabs, Arabs are Muslims, Arab Muslims are extreme terrorists, and therefore Palestinians are extreme terrorists.
And this is absurd. Now there is evidence that there is evidence of Palestinians being violent, but you don't need to use the rest of the region to.
But also you can't generalize and say Palestinians are violent. You know,
No,
some.
you cannot.
Yeah.
No.
And I dare say that there is an inordinate number of Palestinians who are living, raising their families, living normal lifestyles, trying to give their kids as normal a future as they can, who are caught up in this because they're Palestinians and really are apolitical. Yeah. All they want is the freedom to make decisions about their family and raise their children with an element of hope.
And this is really not fair. And time and time again, I do see Israeli side stereotyping of Palestinians and demonization of Palestinians. And I think this is part of the problem. If the
and as you said, the justification has been that it has reduced terror. But if you arrested every American boy between the age of 12 and 18, you would stop school shootings.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's the right thing to do.
Yes, I do think that despite the state of violence that's happening right now, I do think that violence in Israel has gotten to a low enough point that we can start we can start thinking about how do you reduce racial profiling.
So yeah, and again, it comes down to this idea: does the safety of an Israeli warrant the subjugation of an innocent Palestinian?
Innocent, no.
So how do you know who's innocent and who isn't?
Well, I would say with technology, we're getting better and better and better at this. There's a whole bunch of things to be done, putting more scrutiny on Israelis. Now, this also could turn the country into a police state. There's a fine line to be drawn, and you would probably have to find a happy middle ground between excessive surveillance and not enough policing. But
let me ask you another question. If the level of fear amongst the Israeli population, assume for a second that this is true, it's paranoia. It's a non-rational level of fear that's unwarranted given the circumstances. Assume that's true for a second. Mm-hmm. Would you then say that subjugating a whole nation of Palestinians in order to allay that fear is warranted?
Well, if it's not justified, then you don't do that. Like, there are a lot of solutions. One is the two-state solution, basically saying you have your own country on part of the land, and it would lead to, and ideally with open borders and under something like a confederation or a federation. There are a lot of solutions here. Another one state.
Yeah. And again, one of the reasons that it's not the only reason. I know that there are a lot of layers that need to be peeled back. But one of the reasons why one state would be considered non-feasible by Israelis is because that sense of fear. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I do think that's a fair comment, that they still want the guarantee. Now, this also operates on a couple of different assumptions. One is that the Jews are going to be each other's best protectors. That fundamental assumption may hold up nowadays, but for the period of time they are thinking about, I am not convinced it holds up. If you look at the history of the ancient kingdoms split, and there was infighting, and there was infighting in Roman times that helped the Romans take over the country because they weren't presenting a united front against the Romans. And
there was even infighting when Israel was formed between the Mizrahi and the Ashkenazi and the.
Yes, Jews are fairly. There's a lot of heterogeneity in this group, and so will they always be each other's best protectors? That's not completely held up throughout history. There are instances where they've betrayed other groups, for example, and also, if Judaism evolves, then you end up with all kinds of different groups, and how they would interact with each other because they don't yet exist, we don't know. But that's one fundamental assumption. And the other fundamental assumption is that self-determination is the best way to protect. And that's not always clear. So it's one of those things that does seem to have held up in the last, say, 50 years, but does it hold up for 500 years? Not so clear. And so sometimes just being part of a larger group, a larger governmental group, is a better way to protect, because you're part of a bigger coalition than if you just go off on your own, for example.
So would you say that the level of fear that exists currently amongst the Jewish community is warranted? Rather than understandable, would you use the word warranted?
I would say they have. I would say it depends. I think that there are real threats. I think that they need to be acknowledged, but I also think that a lot of people in the Jewish community are mishandling the threats. There are a few different responses. One response is to run away from the Jewish community. And there are not enough people who come back and tell their story about that, for obvious reasons. But it is one of the major stories that is not getting told. Now, this is a problem because this is a valuable world culture. It's a threatened world culture. And the people who are just going to run away are not meeting their responsibilities to preserving this threatened culture.
All right, but do you think that, generally speaking, overall, the level of fear? Let's say Israel. Do you think the general level of fear within Israeli society about being Jewish is warranted?
What do you mean by fear about being Jewish?
The threat to Jews generally. Do you think do you think it's where it should be as a if you were scaling it? Do you think that it's a warranted level of fear, or do you think it's an exaggerated level of fear slightly? Do you think it's an overly exaggerated level of fear? Do you see it as diminishing over time with generations to come?
I think that I have more disagreement with the Jewish community about the way the fear is handled than about the actual level. I would say than about the actual level. I think that they can be hyper responsive to things that I don't consider threats. At the same time, I do think some of the threats are very real. And some of the threats are even being under-acknowledged.
Norman Finkelstein uses the analogy that the Holocaust is being commercialized for the benefit, for political benefit, even maybe for monetary benefit. But do you think there is an element of that?
I think that people do tend to analyze history in a very one-note way. So the Holocaust happens to be that note. And so I wouldn't exactly call it that the Holocaust is commercialized, but that the Holocaust is the go-to example when it was actually quite unusual in a lot of ways. And when the actual assessment of threats needs to put it in perspective. I think that there may be massive anti-Semitism, not in the immediate future, not even in the short-term future, but I do think that if and when anti-Semitism becomes really bad again, it would look different from the Holocaust. There are a number of things that were historically unusual about the Holocaust.
You think that anti-Semitism is definitely going to become an issue at some point in the future?
I think I'm not going to say definitely, but I think that there is a real chance that it would become an issue at some point in the future.
What would drive that?
A number of things. Changing political conditions could drive that. An example might be if worldwide tensions exacerbate because we run out of certain resources or the world becomes overpopulated. A lot of people think that conflicts are going to increase when the world becomes overpopulated. And
why would the Jews, why would that be necessarily pinned on Jews? Because they represent 10 million of a 7 billion world population.
Jews are a relatively small group. They're a relatively prosperous group, and they're a combination of being isolated, distinctive, and dependent on others for their protection, despite the concept of Jewish self-determination. Israel still gets a lot of momentum from its allies. And so, and certainly outside of Israel, Jews are largely dependent on others for their protection. And so if there becomes a movement, it wouldn't take the exact form of the Nazis, but like the Nazis in the sense that they are scapegoating Jews for a larger problem, Jews could be in trouble.
So let's, would it be fair to say that that Jews are overly represented in the 1%ers in the world?
Probably. probably Jews are overrepresented by numbers in the US government, for example, but this does not mean Jews control the country.
No. But if you're looking at the world's wealth, and the billionaires in the world, you'd have an inordinate number of Jews compared. That wouldn't be the majority, obviously, because but in terms of the amount of Jews there are compared to the population of the world, Jews are generally doing fairly well.
Economically, probably the average Jew is going to be wealthier than the average person for a number of reasons. One is that they live in wealthier countries. They're concentrated in wealthier countries. One is that they're concentrated in relatively high socioeconomic classes in those countries. If you look at the tech billionaires, Jews are definitely, for example, disproportionately represented among them.
So if the say the US, and it's something like this, say the top 5% of the wealthy in the US own 95% of the assets. So the wealth is concentrated in the top 5% of the population in the US, which means 95% of the population, and probably the lower socioeconomic, those that are born into poverty and can't break out of that cycle, would see that top 5% as a potential target, probably an excuse for all their woes. If they were attacking that top 5%, is there a danger that it could be seen that they're actually attacking Jews as opposed to attacking the wealthy?
Bernie Sanders has some of that rhetoric. Bernie Sanders is actually a Jewish senator, and he talks about the billionaires, the 1%. That is not an attack on Jews. He uses some of the tropes that have historically been used in anti-Semitic ways to attack the upper class, but it is an attack on the upper class. It is not anti-Semitism. And
it could be mistaken for anti-Semitism, I guess, is the question I'm asking.
What Bernie says could not be mistaken. What Bernie says is general enough that it could not be mistaken for anti-Semitism. Once you start talking about Jews being in it, or singling out specific people who are Jewish. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about Soros, for example. Rothschild is another one. Rothschilds, by the way, aren't even, well, they're still elite, but they're just a rich family. They're not a world-changing rich family anymore. But singling out specific names that are Jewish among that group, or that they think are Jewish even, would be anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and I'm not even suggesting that there is a proper or a right definition. I'm just wondering whether, in the minds of the 95% that are not wealthy, whether some people would see the attack on the wealthy as an attack on Jews.
I've never.
I'm not suggesting that when it is and when it isn't. You know what constitutes an attack, anti-Semitism, what doesn't. I'm just suggesting that a lot of people might just see that as anti-Semitism because they cut through the attack on the rest of the elite and just focus in on the attack on the Jewish elite.
I've never heard that. I've never heard the attack on the elite being anti-Semitism, and I'm being accused of anti-Semitism. I think that for all the ways I could criticize Jewish groups that fight anti-Semitism, Jewish groups that fight anti-Semitism do a pretty good job of distinguishing those particular things.
All right, I don't think there's much that we haven't covered unless you got something else to.
Okay, so overall question, do you think that, what do you think? Do you think that Jewish fears are understandable? Do you think that Jewish fears are justified? And do you think that Jews are responding appropriately to their fears? What's your position on those three things?
Okay, so my view is that that Jews have suffered a lot. I think that their reaction is a human reaction. That doesn't mean that it needs to be a rational reaction. It's just a human reaction. I wonder, and I don't know, I want to say the Tutsis in Rwanda, whether they feel the same way after the Rwandan massacre, or whether the people of East Timor feel that way about the Indonesians. If they live with that level of insecurity, and I don't know what the answer is, and if they do, I wonder how many generations that will continue on, and how strong they have to get before they lose that insecurity. I think Israel's done an amazing job. I don't think, if I was being rational, I don't think that Israeli Jews have anything to fear. Israel is the fourth largest military power in the world, or close to that. It's certainly the largest military power in the region. It has the support of the largest military power in the world. There's nothing that could really threaten Israeli Jews today. I think that, but again, as I said, I think the reaction is a very human one. It's not something that needs to be condemned. Where it sits on the totem pole in terms of rights of other people, is it the one? I think that it's given far too much priority when it comes to the Palestinians. Again, I think there are probably a lot of, but this is the case in any society. There would be extremists that would exploit that. There would be extremists that would exploit the Holocaust in order to push a certain political opinion. I don't think that that's necessarily the majority, but I think there would be a number of Jews that would consider that that's appropriate. That's about as much as I can say. It's very difficult to condemn anybody unless you're in their shoes. So it's for the same reason that it's very hard for me to condemn angry, frustrated Palestinians, because I'm not living that.
Yeah. So also, if Israel got rid of Iron Dome and got rid of the security fence, other countries don't have these things. Do you think that this is a reasonable idea?
I don't think that it is done in isolation. So, for example, I think one of the big mistakes that Israel made was unilaterally pulling out of Gaza. That was that caused, if anything, the three subsequent wars in Gaza, or certainly it would have averted it had they not done that. And it certainly helped Hamas to come into prominence. What they should do is get rid of the security fence in conjunction with a a resolution that tends to a resolution for the conflict that they're going to deploy. So whether it's a one-state or a two-state, let's assume it's a one-state solution. So of course, you'd get rid of the security fence if you have a federation or a confederation. Of course, you'd get rid of the security fence if you had a two-state solution and you had open borders. But the idea is that rather than you're treating the symptoms, you're not treating the cause. So this is very much, the fence is, we've got a whole lot of angry, frustrated Palestinians. Let's put a fence up to stop them from attacking us.
Okay.
As opposed to let's see why the Palestinians are frustrated and angry.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say I'm pretty much with you on what you just said. And I do think that that's almost the litmus test for are Israelis overly worried about security? What happens if you get rid of Iron Dome and take down the security fence? And we both seem to agree that from an Israeli security standpoint, this is not a good idea unless other measures are put in. Therefore, Israeli fears by this definition would be justified.
So if I was an outsider looking in, how it looks is, from a political perspective, Israeli security is paramount. We're being attacked by Palestinians, don't care why, that's their problem. Let's put up a fence and subjugate them to ensure that our security is not being.
Yeah. From my perspective, I think that my take is that this culture, in other words, Jewish culture, needs a paradigm shift. That the security fence and other security measures, they're not a symptom of the security fence, the other security measures, and even the culture of fear are symptoms of other problems with the culture. And so I really think, they're symptoms of other problems with the culture. Palestinians, basically non-Jews, don't really have such clear, specific places within the culture. So,
and you're right, because if let's say it was the UK that was in Israel and it was that culture, the way it would be handled would be very different to the way Israelis are handling it. And if it was Saudi Arabia in there, it would be handled different to the way Israel's handling. So yeah, very much. It's a cultural paradigm shift that's required.
Well, if it were Australia, and they were past being able to commit a genocide like they did of the Aborigines, then what there might have been is a gradual absorption program.
Look, if that had happened, it would be in 3 generations. Really, we should have done that. Let's invite them over for a barbecue. And you're right. I think every country has got its own cultural nuances, and the way that they're going to react is going to be very different.
Yes, and I think that one of the fundamental weaknesses of Jewish culture here is that we don't really have a good system of absorbing people in from the outside. And we haven't had this since ancient times, which is one of the reasons that I'm trying to, even without the issue going on in Israel, I think it's also a cause of our the vulnerability of large sections of our culture in the United States and other parts of the world, that we do not have a good way to absorb people in from outside.
Do you think that an inclusive culture, and this is off the topic now, but you're welcome to cut it out of the video, but do you think an inclusive culture an exclusive culture is going to create more animosity than an inclusive culture? And do you think Judaism is an exclusive culture?
I do think Judaism is too far along the spectrum of being an exclusive culture. And I think that when they're in a not so dominant position, it's okay. And that's what we've been in for much of our history. But coming into a more dominant position, it does create more resentment. And if there's relatively little, especially if there's relatively little natural resentment, like natural resentment by the surrounding culture can keep a culture in either an isolated or a subordinate position. But if you're in a more dominant position, you can take a surrounding environment that's not so resentful and make it more resentful.
Yes.
And this is something that,
even unintentionally,
and this is something that I would like the Jewish communities to really be thinking about. How do they keep their communal life compelling for the people in it? And how do they keep it open to the people outside of it? And this is a different approach to addressing the fear that I believe the Jewish communities are not doing enough of. And that,
I think it would go a long way towards reducing that fear as well. Because of course you're going to be fearful of what you don't know. And you're not going to know what is being kept from you.
Yeah. Yes. So if you keep exposing people to, if you look at psychology, if you keep exposing people to the things that they're afraid of in a non-threatening or even or ideally helpful context, this is one way that fear is treated.
Yes. Yes.
And this is one way that fear is treated. So I think we're going to close. And on the note of, there are things to be afraid of. One of the things to be afraid of is fear itself.
Who said that?
Roosevelt. Roosevelt says the only thing we need to fear is fear itself.
Of course.
And that's kind of one of the things that I think about the Jewish community, that we are not afraid enough of our own fear and what that could do.
Yes.
So I'm going to end with that.
Good point. Lovely as always to talk with you, Miss Rebecca.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Talk soon.
Yes. Bye-bye. Talk soon. Yeah.